we've seen the media push back against trans, which has kind of made it feel more controversial to hire someone in my position. I have been outright told more than once that yeah, it's just too controversial to consider hiring a trans person into a leadership role with the current climate.
It isn't a stretch to think that it is impacting your job search, because companies saying they just don't want the hassle, right? That's the easy plug, isn't it?
I can actually be trans and still be a successful business person.
Hello and welcome to the Open to Work podcast. I'm your host, as ever, Matthew, here to guide you in finding your next opportunity through actionable advice from recruiting and HR leaders. Some of you keen-eyed listeners would have noticed that we've now switched our release date to Monday. So please keep an eye out, start your week right, get some good advice on your job search, and then structure your job search based on the advice that you're getting every Monday from these experts that we're bringing in and going to continue to bring in. Okay, without any further ado, I'd love to introduce our guest for the week, Bertie Jenner. Bertie, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
I've known you for a little while now, but I think we first met when I saw you on stage at nothing other than Wreckfest, which, listeners, if you'll believe it, is a massive festival with thousands of recruiters attending, and it happens once a year.
It's a weird one, right? Because I don't think of myself as a particularly extroverted person, but like it's. I think getting on stage and talking at these conferences kind of validates a lot of the work that you do to kind of make you feel as like people listen and people like what you do. It kind of shows you're not crazy and coming up with insane ideas that don't make any sense. I think I need that validation sometimes. Otherwise, I worry I'm going over the edge.
Why don't we introduce yourself in a little bit more detail? So Bertie, as you were doing in an interview, tell me about yourself.
Sure. Well, not totally like an interview, because I'm going to mention some stuff which I would never discuss in an interview for legal purposes. I'm a head of TA. I have been for the past decade. I've been in TA for the better part of 2 decades now. So I kind of fell into recruitment like a lot of people do around 2006, 2007 on the agency side. I did that for 2 or 3 years. Moved into an in-house role. I think my first role was with the BBC. Doing some interesting sourcing work there. And basically, I mean, what's happened since then is I've gradually taken on a bit more responsibility. So going into kind of a 360 recruitment role, then taking on a broader scope of roles that I'm delivering for, taking on leadership responsibilities and kind of just trying to grow and develop and show a bit of growth with every single role. And then for the past, I would say 12 or 13 years, I kind of started to find my niche, or probably more like my pigeonhole, in terms of working with, I would say, scale-ups. I wouldn't really call them startups, because I've tended to struggle going into those businesses where it's just the founders and you're just dealing with 10 or so people. But those businesses which are at a stage of, I don't know, somewhere between 70 to 100 employees, they're starting to form a semblance of being a real company. And they need someone to basically come in and start helping them have a level of maturity in how they do talent, how they look at their HR processes, basically teaching them how to recruit and understand why they're doing what they're doing. So I've done that with banks. I've done that with IT consultancies. I've done it with SaaS consultancies, all sorts of different industries. But that kind of core idea of teaching people how to do things from scratch and creating functions from scratch, that's been my bread and butter.
Nice. So we were talking, what I think is kind of interesting, the way that we started this is that often in recruiting, we sort of live both in the past and in the future simultaneously. And we have these, I think, because we talk about AI obviously a lot, and I think lots of candidates like perceive us as having these magical AI agents that are doing things on our behalf and taking. But actually, your point at the start is like we're still hearing about things that are relatively basic from like 5-6 years ago as being like kind of quite cutting edge. But we are, whilst being kind of told by the market externally that we are very much on using these kind of innovative AI technologies, it's very rarely is the recruiting landscape quite as innovative than the kind of maybe candidate universe seems to think it is.
Yeah, I think that what you tend to find, or what my experience has been within talent acquisition teams, is that we fall back on our core delivery goals, which tends to be bums on seats, is the reality of it. So I mean, we can talk about the kind of talent efficiencies and performance management and raising the bar in terms of hiring, but at the end of the day, we are there to get bums on seats a lot of the times. And so I think when that's the case and there's stresses on your role in terms of like how do I keep up with this workload? How do I manage what I'm delivering? How do I deal with the pressures from the senior leadership team kind of coming down on me, the hiring managers that I'm working with coming down on me, you tend to fall back on what you know. And what recruiters tend to know is assessing candidates and pushing candidates through a hiring process. And sometimes even some of those elements go out the door. But a lot of the time, they're not thinking about like, look, how do I implement new HR tech stacks into what I'm doing in order to kind of simplify certain processes? It's more, how do I survive? And that tends to mean that you become incredibly reactive, and you tend to focus on the bits that you know well and have done for 10, 15 years, however long you've been in the recruitment game. So yeah, for every company that is doing something innovative and rolling something new out, there's 2 or 3 who are still doing things only just past the fax stage. So yeah, I don't get overly kind of bogged down in the AI stuff.
And just with one other point, the reality is that recruiting technologies handle probably some of the most sensitive data that it's possible to like process through a technology system, and just so very few legal departments are going to be happy to have more and more technologies added onto them. Rather, they want as few data sources and data interactions as possible with your name, address, contact information, phone number. Like, this is not stuff that salary information, like a personal identifier information, is not how people want to be. Like, what legal elements of businesses want to be sharing from technology company to technology company.
Yeah. I mean, as I say, I think it's one of those things where it's so much of employment law and equality rights and all this stuff it seems like it's very kind of hard and fast, but it's such a gray area. So any legal department that can just say no to it will just say no to it, because it's just not in their interest to kind of create 1,000 more headaches for themselves by dealing with that type of stuff.
Now, Alderson James are one of the leading people and talent agencies. Since 2013, they've been responsible for over 1,000 people and talent hires, including one in a company that I used to work at. They helped me hire my head of technology TA. So I know the guys there pretty well. They've been responsible for scaling some of the most innovative companies in the UK and the EU. Also recently just launched in the US. So even folks in your neck of the woods now, James, can get involved for contingent, retained, and executive search. And they also now do embedded through AJX. So they can do it all.
But you have been on the job market for the past year or so. As a recruiter, how has your experience on the job market been?
Pretty dreadful, to be honest. And I think we're our own worst enemies a lot of the times. It's that idea of a chef going home and cooking for themselves. They're not going to want to do it, right? So I think when we come or TA people come to hiring their own roles in their own teams, they tend to fall back on the worst habits they've kind of come across, this idea of kind of really pigeonholing talent into specific areas. And I understand why it happens, right? If you're getting hundreds and thousands of candidates for roles that previously you were getting 20, 30 candidates for, it does become a different challenge, and potentially a challenge that a lot of the recruiters aren't used to. But yeah, it means a lot of things are falling by the wayside. And look, maybe I'm just not as good as I think I am, but it's made me question a lot of things about myself in terms of like, yeah, maybe I'm not a superstar. Maybe there are all these things, but like, it does also feel like there's a large bit of luck, and there's also other things which could go in. But you start leading to your own levels of paranoia with this, right? Like, I mean, I've been in TA for, as I say, the best part of 20 years now. Never had a problem with a job. Never kind of had to beg for anything. Literally day to day, I've never been unemployed till this last 18 months. And for me, the only thing that's been different in that time, and shock horror, I've transitioned. I transitioned about 6 or 7 years ago, largely because at the time I felt that it was a time, based on the pros and cons that I kind of weighed up in my head, that I could get away with transitioning. And I thought it won't affect my job search anymore. I can kind of live authentically without people kind of seeing me as less of a what's the word, less of a, I suppose, kind of a real person in terms of the corporate world. Like, I'm not a joke. I can actually be trans and still be a successful business person. And I think what we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years is society kind of push back against trans to a degree. I'd say society, I think society is probably the wrong word. I would say we've seen the media push back against trans, which has kind of made it feel more controversial to hire someone in my position. I have been outright told more than once that yeah, it's just too controversial to consider hiring a trans person into a leadership role with the current climate, which obviously technically illegal. But if people are saying it off the record, then what are you going to do? And like I say, all of this stuff is a legal grey area. I think when they talk about equality, the Equality Act of 2010, most things can be superseded by another aspect of the Equality Act. So people can kind of get away with saying all sorts of things and doing all sorts of things without having to massively stress on these things. So look, it may not be affecting my job aspirations. It could very much be something that I'm just unqualified and I'm not capable of delivering against these roles. But as I say, the trans thing is the only thing that is different to the last time I was looking for a job, and I've never previously had problems looking for work.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. I think it sounds like there are two things can be true at the same time. I think we have seen like one of the largest macroeconomic shifts ever, like especially in the last like 2 decades. But you obviously were successfully and gainfully employed during the 2008 financial crisis, by the sounds of it, as well, which is one of the other largest macroeconomic shifts in our lifetime. And it sounds like that wasn't an issue, and it does, especially with the cultural culture war that's happening around like the gender identity politics at the moment. It isn't a stretch to think that it is impacting your job search to a certain extent. I would wager, like looking at it from the outside and following your journey for over the last 18 months, I would be surprised if it didn't to some extent, like, because companies saying they just don't want the hassle, right? That's the easy plug, isn't it?
And I mean, I think, as I say, I look to the data over the last 18 months of kind of the job search, right? So obviously, when I say 18 months, within that, there's been contracts, there's been various other things, like I've taken time off for surgeries as well. So like it's realistically been 9 months that I've been looking for kind of proper permanent TA work again. During that time period, there's been 13 jobs where I have made it to the final 2 candidates. And there's been 13 times when they've gone with the other candidate. And again, you kind of build up your own negative thoughts in the vacuum of communications, right? If you don't get anything that's tangible in telling you why they've gone with the other candidate, because I've been too strategic, not strategic enough, too hands-on, not hands-on enough. My leadership style has not been right, but I don't know what the leadership style they were asking for is. So it's very difficult for me to justify that. In that situation where I'm one of 2 and the candidates are both equally qualified and equally capable, like, yeah, why would you take the hassle of hiring the trans person? I think that's a challenge. But as a couple of friends have pointed out to me, though, it's like there's also a level of misogyny which goes into some of this stuff in terms of, well, yeah, you also just have to deal with the fact that you're now a woman looking job. And in that regard, that comes with its own challenges. So sometimes I may be being discriminated against for being trans. Sometimes I may be being discriminated against for just being a woman. You just don't know. But it certainly feels like it must have had an impact at some level.
I feel like I remember you sharing a story around receiving that feedback directly. Are you able to share that, obviously without naming names?
Yeah. And I kind of understand to a degree where they are coming from with it, because and again, without naming names, it is a women's health tech company, health tech startup that was looking for a head of TA. And yeah, one of the agencies affiliated with it explicitly kind of said, like, look, just being level with you, it's too controversial for them to hire a trans woman into a leadership role. I mean, we've seen this. I've seen this in the news with, I think it was a trans woman who was named the CEO of the endometriosis charity, and the kickback that came from the likes of GB News, etc., about like you can't have someone who's trans kind of involved in it. I mean, not to mention that they already had just men in the company, but yeah, a trans person invading those spaces, that's always the bad luck. So I understand kind of the optics that go with it, and I can understand why they would want to shy away from those controversies. But obviously, that still is just my life. There's nothing shy of detransitioning and going back to old school Bertie. There's not much else I can really do about it, right? I can only be me.
No, of course. Do you think that there are, like, the recruiting industry as a whole is kind of creating the right space and having the right conversation around like non-binary and trans people and enabling them to be successful candidates? Or do you think we move forward as an industry when we look at trans and non-binary people in the recruiting industry?
I think recruiters in general, how they have dealt with trans people is valid. And I don't think there's any kind of issue or level of bigotry that goes into anything that recruiters do, TA teams do. And I think they do pay lip service to looking at the DEI side of it. They do pay lip service to kind of making sure that they're trying to be open and transparent and sharing that, like, look, we're an equal opportunity employer. We give everyone an opportunity. I think it shows that it's an afterthought, particularly when you go on to job applications, and every single time there's no consistency in how they're tracking their DEI data around the questions.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember which company it was. It was it was a large corporate governance company, but like one of the questions they asked was, are you cisgender male, cisgender female, or other? And like the number of times you'll have it where it's, are you male, female, or transgender? And it's like, transgender is not a gender in its own right? You're trans woman, you're a trans man, you're this, you're that. Like, the fact that there's so little consistency in how people look at those elements shows that there's going to be inconsistency in how the processes are reviewed in general and the support that people in those scenarios get. And I mean, I've had it in the last week, right? Speaking to recruiters who are like, it's good for our diversity to have someone like you. And they've explicitly said that. And I think they see it in a positive light that they're talking about this type of stuff. But it's just a bit weird. I don't feel like they'd say that about someone with a different skin color or someone from who's a woman in a masculine led organization.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's it's not really been well looked at. But as I say, trans voices are just very quiet out there.
Yeah.
I think someone was commenting on one of the LinkedIn posts I had saying, trans women in particular have to be much louder, much more vocal and kind of shouting about their issues and explaining their issues to people because people just don't understand. It's like, well, I think a lot of people do. A lot of people do shout about this stuff, but if people aren't listening and it's not getting the right platform, then people aren't going to know, right? I've got 8,000 followers on LinkedIn. I mean, it's hardly a huge outreach.
But then, I think there's a kind of an element of telling us that is that LinkedIn is a social media platform which also dials into negative, like, and fuels negative content, right? And I imagine you've had your fair share of like negative responses. And most of the time, I see a lot of positive support on your LinkedIn. But also, as like a job seeker, you're also cautious around what you do want to say because you don't want to poke controversial topics if you're already worried about being deemed as a controversial hire.
Yeah, and it's a difficult line to toe. But I've had several mentors that I talk to on a regular basis who have kind of discouraged me from talking about the trans issues publicly because they say people don't want to hire controversy. People, particularly when a market is as challenging as it is at the moment, people can be as safe and secure with the hires that they make as they want to be. And if you give any hint of controversy or challenge in that regard, I understand why it would be a hesitation for someone in employment. But at the same time, if no one speaks up about this stuff, then it doesn't change, it doesn't improve, nothing can kind of happen with this. Sure. And I think a lot of people don't seem to realize how much worse stuff is getting for trans people over the last kind of 3 or 4 years in terms of the pushback on toilet usage, the pushback on kind of safeguarding concerns around trans people, kind of people trying to repeal elements of the 2010 Equality Act. As I say, the number of my friends who have had access to medical support, basically hormone therapy, taken away from them over the last 18 months, it's scary.
I think when we look at this from like a TA perspective, as a candidate, do you feel like you have a need to voluntarily disclose your gender identity that cisgender people wouldn't have?
I think it's a tough one, right? And I think a large part of it comes down to my own personal confidence, self-esteem, whatever you want to look at it as, in terms of how I see myself and how I think others see me. So I think there's times when I definitely offer the information up because I feel like it's kind of like hanging over the conversation. I think if I don't mention it, like it's always just going to be like the elephant in the room that we're not dealing with. But at the same time, it also accounts for certain stuff, right? Like people are talking about like, well, what have you done for the last year? It's like, well, I did have several significant surgeries, which were kind of taking me away from work. And like, you try and sell it as a positive, right? It's like, well, look, I've got these surgeries out of the way so that when I start working for you, you don't have to worry about me buggering off for 3 months and going and doing this and doing that. But yeah, I mean, it's again, it's one of those things. I don't mind sharing that. I put it on my LinkedIn profile relatively openly. It's information that is out there if someone wants to find it. But I don't want it to be a defining factor on me getting a job or me not getting a job. Like, I want to be taken on my merits. And yeah, I think sometimes if something becomes too loud in that regard, one way or another, that's always what the decision feels like it's being made on, regardless of how capable or incapable you are. The decision is made on identity reasons rather than the actual substance of what you're delivering. And I think I can see that from both sides of the political spectrum in that regard, right? Like, it's like, look, I want to be seen for who I am on that side, and we want to see you for who you are. It's just a case of whether you do that from a place of kindness or a place of hatred, I guess.
And to be also like really clear, I've been in the rooms very explicitly, and obviously I won't name this scenario where they have decided not to move forward with someone because they felt that their social media content was too controversial, be it left wing or right wing, right? And I remember being in that discussion leadership room, and that was the call. And like, so regardless of whether or not you're controversial because of your political stances and transgender issues are like inherently political now, whether you like it or not, basically, which is also unfortunate. This is a stance that a company has to make a decision on, where if they're hiring someone who is cisgender, they don't have to make that decision. And that, therefore, it makes logical sense to follow that through, to think that this decision is happening at scale and it is impacting your search. And I can understand why you would mechanically get to that point, which is super frustrating and is potentially happening as well. Because we both have been in that room, and we know what that room feels like when they make that decision, and we know it's possible that these things are happening.
Yeah, I mean, look, no one's going to write it on the ATS, right? No one's dumb enough to write that onto the ATS. No one's dumb enough to put that in an email. But yeah, do these conversations happen? 100%.
Yeah. Okay, and this is like a final kind of comment before we move on to kind of recruiting more broadly. What do you think the recruiting industry as a whole, if you're kind of sitting here listening to this and you're a recruiter, what do you think they could better do to support you or non-binary people?
I mean, I think on the whole, it's just being mindful. Right. I think having a level of mindfulness when you're going into these conversations, taking a little bit of time to try and educate yourself. I mean, look, it's tough. I don't think people have to do anything in particular. You don't have to visit a certain number of trans candidates. You don't have to make accommodations in interview processes in order to kind of look after trans individuals. But yeah, I think it's just being mindful that these biases exist. Yeah. And I think same with any kind of unconscious bias that goes into a hiring process. If you don't know that it's something to be mindful of, then it's very hard to identify that you're having some sort of a bias or prejudice towards any kind of a decision that you're making in that regard. So, as I say, I would always just ask people to try and be mindfully conscious of what's going on there.
And I guess in my experience as well, when it comes to like diversity and inclusion more like holistically as a topic within recruiting, I often find that recruiters are quite interested in being on the front foot here and doing the right thing by their candidate pipeline if they have the capability and availability to. Like, everyone in my team that I've worked in throughout my career has said, oh, I'd like to do a project around increasing our pool of diverse candidates, etc. And where this kind of tends to fall down is when we then try and translate this into the business and invest, and like it get deprioritized against other kind of output factors that the business is looking to drive.
Yeah. Is there money in it? And the reality is there isn't, particularly not at the moment. So why would it become a priority in that regard? I think that's what it all boils down to. If you can make a business case for why you would do this, then yeah, 100%. Like, you should look at doing it. But I think what you tend to find is it goes one of two ways in this. It's either an afterthought because people aren't willing to put money into it because it doesn't make sense for them to engage in it from that perspective. It's too small a part of the workforce, of the community, whatever it is. There's not enough of an incentive or a punishment for not doing it, right? So if you do it well, no one's going to give you a thumbs up. If you do it badly, like, you're not going to get in trouble. So it doesn't really matter in that regard. But I think a lot of it as well is it's done relatively performatively, in terms of kind of just putting a bit of content onto onto a careers page. And to put it into context from my side as well, as being part of these types of things in organizations, there's never been a business that I've been part of as a trans person that's not asked me to lead their LGBTQ plus employee resource group.
Mhm.
It's like they always want to put me front and center in that type of stuff. And it reminds me of the university college brochures when I was
Yeah.
all those years ago. It's like, look, we want one of this, one of this, one of this, one of this, and one of this, just to show how diverse we are, how capable we are. But is that the reality of what's kind of going into the business? And yeah, I think that the quote that I've always loved on that is the values are not what you write on your careers page. It's the behaviors that are rewarded by leadership. And yeah, I mean, you see that every day, right? If you interact with the business every day, you see what's kind of going into it. You see what the true values are. It's not 4 or 5 key buzzwords that someone writes on a website. It is what you see day to day and how people interact with each other and what actually drives growth within a business.
Yeah.
And a lot of time that's, well, money first, right? That's the reality.
And we're going to be joined in 2 weeks, I think, by a diversity and inclusion specialist who is going to be talking about this topic and what DEI do, and especially in the backdrop of Meta and Microsoft and others publicly pulling their funding for these sorts of initiatives. So definitely tune in for that to kind of get deeper into this topic and why diversity and inclusion is impacting all candidates as well.
We are so excited to be sponsored by HireGuide. HireGuide is an end-to-end interview decision platform that makes hiring decisions faster, fairer, and twice as predictive of on-the-job employee performance. As a recruiting leader, I've been looking for a tool that can help me run better interviews across my organization at scale to make better hiring decisions. So when I found HireGuide, I thought all my hopes had been answered. They use cutting-edge AI and behavioral science to enable you to operationalize structured interviews and skills-based hiring that can help you find those star candidates. Hiring a dream team is no easy task, but with HireGuide, it can be.
How do you think that your experience as a candidate, I guess, over the last kind of few years has kind of changed your recruiting style or leadership, or how would you approach your next job now that you've been based on your experience as a candidate?
I think it depends on how the job market goes. I think we're in a position at the moment where when you look at the amount of talent that is available and applying for these jobs, it is a very different way of hiring to what it would have been 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're past that idea of the war on talent, this idea that there's only a few good qualified candidates out there that are capable of delivering a lot of these roles. And you're just desperate to get your hands on 1 or 2 of them that can kind of loosely fit the requirements, and we can kind of train up the rest of it. I think what you're looking at now is how can you humanely deal with an incredibly high volume of candidates without completely kind of ruling them out and saying that they're never going to work for you and they'll never want to work for you because you've given them such a bad experience. But at the same time, make sure that you can effectively assess against that. So I think that comes back to, I think, really focusing on working with teams on clarifying what the expectations of a person coming into a role are. I think in the past, we would have kept that quite broad and looked at kind of key drivers and motivators from a personality perspective, key behaviors, with the fact that the skills become a secondary thing, right? Whereas I think that skills-based side of it now is going to become much more significant, and having clear clarity on what that looks like up front by working with the senior leadership team, the hiring managers, the people within the business to understand where the skill gaps within those teams are, to make sure that what we're fitting in actually fits, rather than just kind of hoping for the best to show up and get it in there. So yeah, it's how do you deal with volume in a kind of mindful and caring way. But how do you make sure the right things are actually fitting in, and how can you be clear on that to make sure that you're giving the right level of feedback to people, you're giving the right instructions back to people, and the talent that comes into the organization is the best, if that makes sense.
And I think you're one of my takeaways listening to you there is the only way to really deal with volume is to be specific. And that will mean that a lot of people who are probably qualified and could do the job will just end up being eliminated as a result of we know that we can get someone who's, let's say, arbitrarily a 90% match or more, whereas before we would have accepted someone who's a 70% match. I would say the challenge is that we have at least moved forward in that if it a decade ago, it would have been, well, you didn't go to this, the way that to be specific was you didn't go to the university we liked. And I don't think that that's quite as prominent in recruiting as it would have been 10 years ago.
Yeah, that specificity is definitely part of it, but I think it's having the clarity as to why that is the case. Because I think it's one of those things that you go back to that idea of like, well, they went to Nottingham, they didn't go to Durham. It's like, yeah, but what does that mean? It's like, why is that a significant element in why we're making the decision that we're doing?
Meant to, between the ages of 14 and 16, they were quite smart.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
one of those things where there's no quantifiable reason why you would choose one over the other. Whereas I think you can be specific with skills in this regard and give people clear feedback on what that looks like. And I think we should be at a stage now where we can be specific with a candidate to not just say it's like, oh, we've gone with other people because they were we just had a high pool of candidates and it's very, very competitive out there. We should be able to be specific with feedback to a higher volume of candidates based on usage of AI, based on the simple things that we can summarize and pull out of this information to say, like, look, we have gone with this person for X, Y, and Z. We would consider you for this based on this. We think you're worth this because of this. That the specificity less comes about kind of saying that someone is incapable of doing something just because they don't tick a box, but more saying what they would be like capable of delivering for an organization like yourself based on that. So it's not a case of ruling people out forever. It is just a case of saying like, look, we know what exactly fits into this hole at the moment. It's more like that idea that you used to get with like Moneyball. You know, it's like, it's not a case of having to replace a superstar with a superstar. It's understanding like, look, what holes do we have in this team right now that need to be fixed? What's that going to look like 2 years down the line? How do we kind of put someone into that place that's actually going to make the team functional again, rather than just thinking a player. And genuinely, if I see a job interview that has
a player means
yeah,
that you only ever go and buy people who've like played for the New York Yankees in the Moneyball and like context, right? You only hire people who look
yeah,
and sound and feel a specific way. Whereas if you're able to identify like the skills taxonomy of a group of what you need to be successful, then you can hire specifically for that skills group that is going to be the supplementary thing that can help you challenge the New York Yankees or like Google, even though you're just, you know, a smaller team, which is, I think, a really good analogy for skills-based hiring concepts.
I mean, have you ever worked for a company that has said as part of the hiring process, or has not said as part of the hiring process, we have an incredibly high hiring bar?
Yeah.
Like every company thinks they have an incredibly high hiring bar. It's not always the case, right? But like every company believes they're going after A players. No company is willing to admit and say like, actually, we can get by with C players in this role as long as they fit the right kind of, as long as they're the right type of person. And I think that's a reality that people aren't willing to admit a lot of the time.
When you reflect back over the last kind of 18 months, based on your learnings and some of the experiences you've gone through, what kind of advice would you give to candidates now who are looking for a job?
I think a sad reality is the industry isn't going to fix itself. You can't wait for the industry to fix itself. You kind of need to go out there and stand out on your own and figure out how to get yourself above those 500, 1,000 other candidates that are going for those same jobs that you are looking at. Be specific, be creative, come up with innovative ideas, because that's the only way it's going to happen. The industry is not going to suddenly fix and notice your abilities.
Yeah.
You have to really put yourself out there and look for that. That's the only way I've got anything. I think for the first kind of couple of months of looking, I didn't get a single job interview, but it's because I didn't kind of try and reach out or do anything special. Like I'd apply for the job. I think, yeah, I tick the boxes for that. Like, yeah, good enough. Then I'd get rejected and be like, it's weird. Like I tick all the boxes for what they're looking for. Like, why would I not get a look in? But then there were jobs where, I don't know, a month after application, I would just send a message to the CEO, record a video, send it to them and say like, hey, look, see, you're still hiring for this. Like, I've applied, didn't hear anything back. I think I could be a good fit for X, Y, and Z. Can we have a chat? And suddenly you're in the first round, the second round, the third round, you're going through the process. Obviously, it hasn't landed me a job, but it's got me to that final round in a way that I wouldn't have got seen otherwise. So I think, look, you just have to do what you can to stand out and not put a foot wrong. When you're up against this many other people, it's about how few mistakes you can make to get through that process and tick the boxes, because there is always an element of guessing, right? Like if you're one of 100, like you're still rolling a die every time. Even if you're the best one out of that 100, there's no guarantee that you're going to get through. So you have to assume that there's got to be an element of luck, but how do you reduce that number as much as possible to give yourself as best possible chance? And yeah, that comes with being creative and doing your best to stand out rather than waiting for the problem to solve itself and fix things for you.
And I think there's also like, I love everything that you've said there. And as someone who's been hiring recently and has been looking at CVs and receiving kind of applications and stuff like that, like one of the things that I've noticed is that actually sending an email directly to me or sending a LinkedIn connection, just sending a basic LinkedIn email is really not enough for me to go and look at you again. I would like look at your profile, I'll look at your message, but the reality is that all of these messages are like basically the same. And a couple of people have sent looms. I'll probably look at a loom because I appreciate that. I'm like a really big fan of that format, and it's a kind of how we work asynchronously here at Muse as well. So I'll be more likely to look at that. But really, the ones where I end up actually looking at them or when they've been referred, but like when I see some sort of referral or some sort of cachet attached to them, which is biased, yes, it is, but there's a reality where that person has been advocated for. The second reality is that even if they are referred for, I still won't speak to you if you are completely irrelevant for the role or like quite significantly away from what I'm looking for. And just because you have that arbitrary kind of connection doesn't guarantee that next step. And out of like, let's 500 applications that I would receive, at least 200 to 300 of those applications are completely irrelevant or have functionally wrong location requirements or similar. Before we even get to the ones that are like sort of relevant. And I do encourage candidates really to focus in on going above and beyond for the roles where they are genuinely fantastic matches for. They've done a kind of role really similar in a similar industry at a similar size and scale. They can articulate their value and their impact they can have really effectively as well. Like that's where you will play your odds the best and put in more resources to apply for fewer roles rather than the same amount of resources apply for hundreds of roles. And so to wrap us up, Bertie, what would be your top 3 recommendations for candidates at the moment?
Really go after the jobs that you think you're a good fit for. Really try and stand out for those positions and push, message people. I would say don't be afraid to annoy people as part of your interview process. Like, look, if they're not going to give you the job, like message the CEO. Go past that person. Go and message the CEO and try and get yourself involved. Because I mean, look, what have you got to lose at that point? That recruiter's already kind of drawn a line under you and said that you're not relevant. So go past them. But yeah, I think beyond that, just like be patient, try it or do your best to be patient. Like give yourself side hustles so that you can kind of give yourself a longer runway in order to find the right type of a job. I mean, that's what I'm doing. I'm coaching paddle randomly. It gives me just that bit more time to actually find a job that is relevant. But yeah, I would say those are the main two. Just give yourself as much time. Trust that, like, look, you are going to have to get lucky to a degree. But yeah, go and annoy some people.
I think that kind of comment of being lucky, it really does feel like there is a strong element of that. But Johnny Wilkinson always used to say, who's an English rugby player, the more you practice, the luckier you get. And when you put in these like foundational elements that we talk about through this podcast, like you network with people, you go and listen to the right podcasts, you do the right research, you do this enough times and your luck will be more likely to strike the longer that you invest into it, rather than kind of giving up or going back into like old like negative habits. And so, that wasn't supposed to be a plug, but like, keep listening, keep trying to practice and implement some of the stuff that we talk about through all these episodes, because they do have a long tail impact. And as you kind of build up the skill of this, it will get easier and hopefully your responses rates will go up and you'll find that next fantastic job. Awesome. Thank you so much, Bertie. Where can people find you if they want to hear or learn more about you?
Well, as I say, it's whether or not they want to hear me keep moaning about stuff. I mean, obviously I'm on LinkedIn. As I say, Bertie Jenner. I think I'm the only Bertie Jenner on there, so I should come up fairly quickly. I have an Instagram, LG Bertie.
Nice.
But yeah, I mean, beyond that, as I say, just LinkedIn's the best bet. LinkedIn is where I'm going to post stuff from a work perspective that's relevant for individuals. Anytime I'm doing a talk, it's going to be put on there, and you'll see content through that. But that's the best bet.
Nice. Shows the age and cohort of people that I've been speaking to. You're the first person who shouted out their Instagram handle, and I think we're on episode 38 or 9 at this point.
Yeah, no Snapchat, no TikTok, just Instagram.
And thank you everyone for listening to this week's episode. Feel free to continue to follow Bertie on LinkedIn. I certainly do, and you'll probably see me pop up in the comments a few times as well. If you want to hear more from us, check out our back catalogue. We're here. We've got now hundreds of videos on YouTube as well as on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And you can also get this advice and more every single week in our weekly digest and the Get Hired Toolkit. So Google it. Show notes. It's in the show notes. You can get weekly advice into your inbox. Okay, thank you so much, Bertie, again, and we'll see you all next Monday.
Thanks a lot.